Hello, my name's Andrew, this is my van Morpheus, and today we're going to be doing a DIY subfloor install for van life with havelock wool insulation. After going through a bunch of articles and videos on flooring for van life, it basically seemed like there are two schools of thought. Number one, use a vapor barrier to completely seal off moisture, or number two, leave room for airflow to keep the van dry naturally. But while more protection sounds good in theory, I've always found that tight waterproof hiking and running shoes actually tend to trap moisture, which leads to damp, sweaty feet, whereas loose breathable materials tend to move it away from your body and keep you more dry. So for my subfloor insulation, I want to have havelock wool, which is naturally moisture wicking, temperature regulating, antimicrobial, flame resistant, and safe to breathe versus synthetic or rock wool insulation, which release toxic particles out into the air. FYI, I put a link down below to a written guide with step-by-step instructions, plus a list of tools and materials we'll be using for the install. The first thing I did was measure the walls and wheel wells in my van and make a layout sketch with my Supernote tablet so I knew how much lumber to buy. Next, I used a tape measure to mark out 1.5 lines every 12 inches with wider 2.5 inch gaps where the edges of my plywood boards would meet, and then cut a bunch of 3/4 inch pine support beams and other spacer blocks down to size on my dad's table saw, leaving around a 1/2 inch gap on each side for airflow. I then covered the wood with some non-toxic waterproof sealant by Vermont Natural Coatings, applying one layer on with a foam brush, adding a second layer while the wood was still damp, repeating the process for the bottom once the top side had dried, and then leaning them up against the railing for 3 to 4 hours. Before going any further, I patched a few holes in my van with epoxy, and then thoroughly wiped it clean with rubbing alcohol. Once the floor was dry, I used a caulking gun to apply some Loctite adhesive to the metal ribs running vertically along the van floor, as well as to the 1/2 inch blocks anywhere there was a large gap, and then pressed the wood support beams into place, using half-filled paint cans and whatever other random objects I had lying around in the basement to weigh them down for 24 hours while the glue cured. Annoyingly, the Ford Transit's metal floor ribs are actually more like 7/16 rather than a 1/2 inch, so I just made sure to lay down the adhesive thick enough to compensate for the tiny gaps created by my 1/2 inch support blocks. Back in my dad's shop, I used my floor plan sketch to mark cutout areas on my 3 plywood boards, and then shape them using a circular saw and jigsaw to get some of the harder to reach areas. Before moving on, I dry fitted the plywood boards to make sure they went together smoothly, after which I repeated the waterproofing process with a larger foam brush. While that dried, I opened up my first box of havelock wool and cut each bat down to size with a pair of scissors, laying it down between the wood supports and working my way down to the end of the van. Honestly, installing havelock wool has been my favorite part of the van build so far, just because it's so soft and puffy. It has this really natural smell to it. It's kind of like an earthy kind of smell, and it's just such a break from having to work with all these toxic adhesives, that just like your lungs are burning and you feel like you're gonna get particles, into your lungs. And then it's like with wool, it's just something you can touch with your hands, and you don't have to wear a mask, you don't have to wear gloves. So I'm really happy with it. I'm glad that I went with this as opposed to some kind of synthetic insulation. And you can already hear like how much it's deadening the sound. Before, I was getting this really annoying metallic ring, and now with just this on the floor, like, it sounds much more natural to me. And then once I get it on the walls and up on the ceiling, I feel like it's gonna be really amazing for filming in here. Because the support beams were gonna get covered up by the plywood, I marked their locations with a permanent marker on the van walls, laid down the 3 plywood boards, marked them as well with a ruler, and then pre-drilled holes with a countersink every 8 to 12 inches or so across the middle and around 1.5 inches at each end. Next, I lifted out the plywood and worked on one section at a time, tucking any stray tufts of wool out of the way, caulking the support beams with a thin bead of Loctite, laying down the plywood, and then fastening it into place with 1-inch stainless steel screws. Overall, installing a subfloor of havelock wool insulation for van life was actually kind of relaxing because there was a lot less mess and more margin for error than with my window installs. And now that I have a solid base, I can move on to framing and insulating the rest of my van. That said, if you'd like to support the channel, you can shop the referral links down below, check out my van build playlist for more install guides, or watch my van life day 1 video to see what it's like moving into a Ford Transit for the first time. Finally, if you have a question about installing a subfloor of havelock wool insulation or about van life in general, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time. Peace.